Don't you wish you could speak like that? Okay. Hopefully we will be able to stay connected through the whole class. It's already dropped twice on me this morning. So things don't seem to be all that stable, but we'll see how things go. Okay, so yesterday we ended by looking at Psalm 4, verse 6. It is a question. The first line of Psalm 4, verse 6 is a question. The second line, we had a question about. And I asked you to think about, how do you think that verse should be read? In some translations, David is quoting a question. He says, there are many who say, who will show us any good? That's New King James. But then we saw that there are some translations that continue that quote down to the second line. So what do you think? Where do you think the quote should end? After the question or after the second line?
I thought it should end after the second line, because it says the first one is, who can show us any good? And the second one is, let the light of your face shine upon us. So it seems like the same people are still talking.
Yeah. And that is why several translations continue the quote or don't close the quote until after that. There are some things to think about, though, with regard to that. People, David is saying there are many people who make this statement, a question followed by what amounts to the answer to that question. How does that fit with the rest of Psalm 4? What are your thoughts?
I'm thinking that it makes sense given the way people are living, or the way David talks about the people, that they would ask who will show us some good, not finding anybody. Given the rest of the Psalms 4, I can see the quote ending after the.
What was that reference? Psalm 4.
What did I say?
You said Psalms 4.
Did I?
Yes, you did.
Right on.
Okay. Anyway, sorry. Keep going.
I don't remember where I was at.
Well, just talking about the people that are referenced in Psalm 4. Sorry, I derailed you. Well, what is David instructing the people he is addressing in Psalm 4? What seems to be the issue that he is talking about? What kind of people are they? We did talk about, are these believers in terms of part of the Israelite community, God's covenant people, things like that. And David's instructions had to do with offering sacrifices of righteousness and meditating and things like that. And so we talked about how those instructions only make sense biblically if he is addressing people who are familiar with the covenant relationship that they are supposed to have with the Lord and things like that. So with that in mind, what are some other things that you think about, especially with verse 6? There are many who say, who will show us any good? Followed by the statement, Lord, let the light of your face shine upon us. Can you argue the other way, that the quote should end after the question mark?
That's how I view it, is it's David continuing the idea from, like, he's talking to the same people, or he's talking about the same people in verses basically like 2 through 5, and then he's quoting them almost and saying, like, why won't you show us any grace? And then at the end of the psalm, he's talking to God. And so I would cut it off in a different spot.
Yeah. And so this is kind of the debate with Psalm 4. This is the big question. And so what I'm going to do is, let me make sure I have this correct. All right, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to read it. Okay, on Bible Hub, there's a really cool feature. I have Psalm 4, verse 6 here, but in these navigation links here, one says parallel, and this lets you pull up a reference like we have here. Let me make this larger and see this verse in several different translations. And let's just take a look at where the quote marks end, translation by translation. NIV closes the quote after the question mark. NLT does also. English Standard closes the quote after the second line. Berean Study Bible, after the question mark. King James, there are no quote marks. New King James, it's after the question mark. New American Standard, I assume this is the 2020 version because it also lists the 95 and the 77. And all three of those close the quote after the question mark. Amplified after it's an exclamation point instead of a question mark. Christian Standard after the question mark. Holman Christian after the question mark. American Standard, no quotation marks. This is interesting. Aramaic Bible in plain English. Anybody use that translation? No, I don't either. But there are several more, and you could go down through this list, and it seems to be that the majority of translations close the quote after the question mark. But there are several that close the quote after the second line. Why are translators not sure? Why do you think this is even a question?
I'd guess because they're, oh, never mind.
There aren't any punctuation marks in the original text. So in the Hebrew Bible, you don't have quotation marks. You do have, I don't have this up here. Let me see. No, I have a bookmark somewhere here. That's right. In the Hebrew Bible, there are all kinds of, not only those little vowel pointing things, you've seen that before, little dots and dashes and things like that above and below the letters. They also have a little accent marks that are especially useful for cantors in a synagogue. Do anybody know what a cantor is?
Is that like a song?
The singer, yeah. It's like musical notation. So when you look at a passage or any passage, but especially in the Psalms, that helps the cantor, who's the worship leader, for the music. It helps them to know what to do, musically. I don't know what to do musically, but the cantor does. And so there are all kinds of little marks like that, in addition to the vowel pointing. And so those can give you a clue about things such as quotes and where are the quote marks and so forth, but it's just not the same. We have typography, which would be things like italics, imprinted text, and bold and punctuation marks and all that kind of stuff. So we have a lot of help in our modern printed texts, from Bibles to just regular books and things like that. But the original Hebrew text didn't have that kind of thing. And so it's an interpretive help that publishers and translators do for us. But as you see, they're not all in agreement. So back to the verse itself, if there are many who say, who will show us any good? And then they answer that themselves. It gives the idea that there are a lot of people who know where to find the answer to the kind of stress and conflict that David is dealing with in Psalm 4. And yet the rest of the psalm, addressed to, "O you sons of men, how long will you love worthlessness and falsehoods and lies," and things like that, he is rebuking the people he is addressing because of how they are handling the situation. And so you could make a good point, like some of you have already said, that this quote includes line 2. But it seems to fit more with how he's addressing the people that he's talking to by giving this quote as he's telling these people what to do in this situation. Meditate on your hearts, on your bed, and be still or be quiet. He's giving them those kinds of advice, points of advice and what to do. And then the question could be a summary of the reason these people are so upset in this situation is that they are looking for answers. Who will show us any good? Who is going to lead us out of this situation? And David, with that question in mind, immediately turns his focus back to the Lord and says, "Lord, you need to be our source here for the answer." So that's the way that that I see it and understand what David is doing in the psalm. But it is an open question, and it would take a little bit more digging to come to a firm conclusion. So you guys can do that in your spare time. All right. So if we take that approach, what David is saying, I hope you have Psalm 4 open, back there in verse 6. There are many people who are looking for some kind of goodness out of a situation. They're looking for some kind of relief. And the question, who will show us anything along those lines, is it shows an awareness that in and of ourselves, we don't have the ability to handle this particular situation. A lot of times we think, oh, not a big deal, I'll handle it myself. But in this particular situation, people are looking for some kind of help and relief, and they're not getting it. And so he turns our focus back to the Lord. Now, with everything that we have discussed so far in Psalm 4, let's go back and start working our way through the Psalm and seeing what we can discuss here. I need to get out of the parallel. There we go. Psalm 4. The superscription, the introduction to this psalm, does not give us the historical context. It is addressed to the chief musician, and there is musical instruction here about how the psalm should be sung or played, performed. So we talked about how, here in the Blue Letter Bible, there was that list of all the psalms with their probable occasions of writing. And there are several, there are about at least, I think, 10 psalms that are attributed to when David fled from Absalom. But there are only maybe a couple where that whole situation is actually specified in the heading of the psalm. So what do you do with that? We need to consider the historical background when we have it. But when we don't, and we've got a list like the one that we looked at, and we're thinking maybe Psalm 4 was written during this whole period of conflict with Absalom. What you do with that is that since we cannot say for certain that that was the historical setting of this psalm, what we do is we say this is a great example of the kind of distress David is talking about in Psalm 4. And so if you are teaching through the Psalms and there's no historical note about the background of the Psalm, you can look at the list that we found in Blue Letter Bible, and you can use the references that they give there as an illustration of the kind of thing that the Psalm is talking about. So that's pretty cool. It's always good to be able to relate the kind of things that you read about in the Psalms to a specific situation in the history of Israel or in the life of the psalmist. And so that's where that information can be very helpful. So whether or not Psalm 4 actually is specifically written during the time of Absalom's rebellion, that is a good illustration of the kind of thing that David is discussing in Psalm 4. Now, look at verse 1. We talked before about how this psalm begins with an appeal to the Lord. And the second line there, you have relieved me in my distress. What does that mean?
It means that when David was distressed, God gave him relief.
Yeah, exactly. And how did he do that? How did the Lord give David relief?
A couple times it mentions that God answered him and heard him when David called to him.
Yeah. So it's in the relationship that David had with the Lord and God, David speaking to the Lord and his prayer of confidence in the Lord. if this situation of Psalm 4 has to do with Absalom's rebellion, what kind of relief did, uh-oh, are we frozen?